challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives on George Samueli. And it is now 9:15 p.m. in the grimmest, darkest, sunless, lightless city of Budapest that you've seen in a long time. So gray is it that you long for night to fall because you don't have to look out into the grayness. And it's only still early December. So, on that very cheerful note, thank you everybody who has joined me. Ahmadovich says, "Good greetings, George, on this cold evening." Yeah, I should have mentioned it's also extremely cold. Um, and see, Carlos FR. It's a long time we haven't seen Carlos. Good to see you. Dr. Samiani, long time no see. Hope you've been doing all right. Well, I'd be doing a lot better if it wasn't so dismal outside. Um, so you know I'm just reading here. Ahmadovich says, according to Articles 53 and 107 of the UN Charter, Germany and Japan explicitly ban from arming, and if they engage in armament, does international law legally authorize Russia or China to conduct a preemptive strike? I don't think that you are ever authorized to conduct a preemptive strike. Also, I mean, Germany and Japan have been arming themselves really for a long time. Germany began rearmament in 1949. And then, of course, it joined NATO in 1954. So we've kind of lived with an armed Germany and Japan for a long time. So somebody says watching you from Kintabo, Ghana, West Africa. Well, that's very nice. I spent some time in Ghana as a child. That was a long time ago. Wow. But yeah, I can't say it was a great deal of fun, but I was still very young then, and I was sent off to a boarding school in in Achimota, and that was a miserable time. It was like, really really unpleasant. Um, and so anyway, but so a couple few things I want to talk about. I mean, one of it obviously is that there's the meeting taking place in right now in Moscow, between Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, and then of course the Russians. Somebody, Peter Kovic says, under Nkrumah. Yeah, it was under Kwame Nkrumah. Well, that's how long ago it was. So that was how we. I mean, that's basically how we managed to leave Hungary, because of course Nkrumah in those days. This was just very early in the years of Ghanaian independence, and Nkrumah had kind of befriended the Soviet Union and, of course, the Eastern European states. So he was basically inviting academics from Eastern Europe to come and teach in Ghana, and that's how my father ended up in Ghana. So someone says, you're always welcome back to our lovely Ghana. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Yeah, that actually would be very nice. The beaches were quite stunning, I have to say. That I mean, this was the Atlantic Ocean. That is some serious beaches there. That was quite stunning. Um, Anyway, so the meeting is taking place in Moscow. Um, no, I didn't. No, no, it was on holiday. It wasn't a holiday home in Ghana. It was Ghana was the stop on the way from Hungary to the UK. So that was just went from Hungary to Ghana. Um, Anyway, so this meeting taking place in the Kremlin. I mean, still going on at the moment, because but even I think if it ends abruptly while um, uh, 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 while we're speaking. I doubt whether anything very much will transpire other than a kind of innocuous um, readout, useful, constructive conversation, because Witkoff and Kushner will have to head back to Washington and tell Trump what the gist of the conversation was. But before the meeting with Witkoff, Putin took the opportunity today to uh, vent very reasonably about the Europeans, and I just want to show you a little bit from his what he said, which is kind of amusing. I mean, nothing that we haven't said on the Gaggle and elsewhere, but it's always entertaining to listen to Putin uh, venting about the useless Europeans. Um, well, yeah, here we are. And so here's the Putin. So the first question is: You're meeting soon with Steve Witkoff, who came to Moscow specifically for this purpose. Currently, negotiations are essentially limited to the American side. Why are the Europeans silent? Why are they so removed from the process? Well, the Europeans are not silent, of course. They haven't stopped talking. They're talking all the time. It's just that they don't want the peace talks to succeed. And here says the European. That's in fact what Putin says. The Europeans are not silent. They are offended by the fact that they have been excluded from the negotiations. But I want to point out that no one excluded them. They excluded themselves. For a while, we had close contact with them. Then they abruptly cut off contact with Russia. This was their initiative. Why did they do this? Because they adopted the thesis of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia and apparently still live in this illusion. Although they understand, they know in their heads that this is long in the past, that such a thing could not have happened. They accepted wishful thinking at the time, but they cannot admit it to themselves. They do not want to. They remove themselves from this process. That's the first thing. And then, second, seeing that they don't like the outcome today either, they began to hinder the current US administration and President Trump's efforts to achieve peace through negotiations. They themselves have abandoned peace negotiations and are hindering President Trump's efforts. Third, they have no peace agenda. They're on the war side. And even when they try to make some changes to Trump's proposals, we clearly see that all these changes are aimed at one thing: blocking the entire peace process, putting forward demands that are completely unacceptable to Russia. They understand this, and thereby blaming Russia for the collapse of the peace process. That's their goal. We clearly see it. And then so, and then he says, well, Seato, that is obviously referring to the Hungarian foreign minister, actually said that today we could find ourselves in a state of war with Europe, literally today. He says that NATO, its European part, plans to have its troops on full combat readiness by 2029, and by 2030, there is a risk of armed conflict. This is truly a very serious matter, almost sensational. What is your take on this? Are we really preparing for anything? And then Putin says, we have no intention of going to war with Europe. I've said this 100 times, but if Europe suddenly wants to fight us, and does, we're ready right now. There can be no doubt about that. The question is what? If Europeans suddenly start a war with us, it seems to me that it would happen very quickly. This isn't Ukraine. We're dealing with Ukraine surgically, carefully. Understandable, right? This isn't a war in the literal modern sense of the word. If Europe suddenly wants to start a war with us and does, then a situation could very quickly arise in which we'll have no one to negotiate with. So it seems like he's saying, well, if we go to war with Europe, we aren't going to do anything in half measures. I mean, we're going to really hit them hard. With Ukrainians, you say, well, we're dealing with them surgically, carefully, but we're not going to treat the Europeans surgically and carefully. We will just hit them with everything we've got. And I think that's what he means by a situation could very quickly arise in which we'll have no one to negotiate with. And then anyway, so that's that, and then so that's very interesting because again, is obviously Putin is trying to fuel divisions um, uh, uh, between Europe and the United States. And as I said before, I don't think that fundamentally that can work. I think Europe and the United States are joined at the hip. Neither Europe nor the United States has any intention of separating from the other. And that's why I think ultimately this whole peace process is doomed. The only conditions under which it could succeed is if Trump were basically to say, to Ukraine, well, that's it. We're not doing this anymore. We're not providing you with any intelligence. We're not going to provide you with any satellite guiding systems. We're not going to provide you with weapons. We're not going to provide you with diplomatic support. If the Europeans want to do it, let them do it. But we're not going to help out. I mean, Trump could do that, and I think that would I think bring the war to an end. But that would obviously cause great deal of distress in Europe, and that could certainly lead to a rupture within NATO. And I think Trump doesn't want to do that, and that's why I think he's stuck in this position. He keeps saying, having these peace initiatives, but each of these peace initiatives always follows a familiar arc. He's the Russians will say, okay, well, this is what we are looking for, and Trump says, well, okay, that's okay with me. I couldn't care less what Ukraine's eastern borders are going to look like. I don't care what the terms of this final agreement are. I just want to get this war over and done with because it just doesn't suit America's interests. But the Europeans are now absolutely, totally preoccupied with Ukraine, and they're not going to just let that go. So each time this happens, they're going to go to Trump and say, "You can't possibly let us down. You can't possibly just walk away from this. This is NATO very existence is on the line." And I think that works. I think that's going to work with Trump, and that's why it's sometimes I get a little optimistic, but mainly I think I would have to think that there's not going to be any kind of a deal. Even let's say Witkoff and Kushner, they head back to Washington tonight to Trump, and then Trump says, "Hey, well, this is quite promising. Look, we're moving in the right direction," and then as soon as he does that, of course, von der Leyen is going to get on the phone, and then Starmer and Macron and Merz and all the rest. Oh no, you can't do that, so on. So Russia can try and play on these divisions. Understandable that they want to play on these divisions between America and Europe, but I don't think that's that's basically is going to be a successful strategy. What I think is quite interesting is this remarkable transformation where, let's say, in the 1990s, the Americans were the really belligerent. They were the hawkish, particularly when it came to Yugoslavia. They were the ones who were pushing for continuation of the war, pushing for bombing the Serbs. Whatever peace plan it was put forward, the Americans said, "Oh no, we don't know, absolutely not." That's rewarding the Serbs. It's rewarding ethnic cleansing. It's too generous to the Serbs. And the Europeans were saying, look, I mean, let's just get this war over and done with. Let's finish it off. No, we can't do that. We can't reward the Serbs. We can't reward ethnic cleansing. And so so therefore, what and the Americans eventually prevailed. I mean, there were all the various peace plans through the 90s to end the war in Bosnia were thwarted by Clinton and Madeleine Albright. And eventually they came to, began bombing the Serbs in 1995. But the Europeans were the more um, constructive, the more peace driven position. And but it has changed now, because now um, what we have is that the Americans say, well, let's wrap this up, and the Europeans say, no, we got to keep it going. Just like when we were talking the other day about this new idea. Oh, we've got to have war crimes trial. We have to put the Russian leaders on trial. And Trump can't possibly start talking about a peace plan in which there's amnesty all around. No, we can't have any. And that's the exact opposite of what was going on in the 90s, where the Americans were saying, no, we need these, we need all these tribunals, we need war crimes trial, there has to be accountability, and so on. And the Europeans were saying, well, the most important thing is to get peace. That's more important than interminable trials. The problem arises that all bad habits, start in the United States, and then they spread to the rest of the world, and then the rest of the world just sort of adopts it. However debilitating it is to most of the rest of the world, and they can't get out of it. So all of these bad habits about, let's keep the war going, let's have war crimes trial, that all started in the United States. But then the Europeans embraced this, and while the United States began to get skeptical about this, but the Europeans are absolutely besotted with the idea of just keeping this war going and holding these ridiculous, interminable question. And so that's so that was that. The other thing um, that I want to talk about is a little bit. Is obviously there's the question of the question of the with Venezuela. So it seems Trump is determined to embark on this war with Venezuela. It seems like um, I mean, Maduro has attempted to have these kinds of talks with the United States, and I think that hasn't really worked very well. So the more he does this, um, the, um, the weaker he seems, and that only encourages Trump. So we remember when there was apparently he had offered the United States pretty much, first dibs on everything, um, and that was just amazing kind of offer. Just saying, look, we'll give you, into oil fields, oil industry, all the natural resources extraction, we'll give you a nice fat percentage of everything, if you just leave us alone. And of course, that hasn't worked, because that's only encouraged Trump further. So something like that seems to be happening now, and I just want to find where he's apparently. Um, let me where I'm going to get onto the question of the war crimes issue, but let me just find this. Yeah, all right. This is because there's an interesting article in the Miami Herald about the gist of this conversation that, Trump had with Maduro, where he's pretty much telling Maduro, "Hey, why don't you just pack your bags and get the hell out, and then we won't attack your country." So um, Here's the Miami Herald story. And so here it says White House gives Maduro ultimatum as U.S. moves toward land operations. As Washington prepares to launch land attacks inside Venezuela, a long awaited phone call between the White House and Caracas aimed at diffusing the crisis carried a blunt message for strongman Nicolas Maduro. You can save yourself and those closest to you, but you must leave the country now. Um, so just you leave the country, basically, it's a real kind of hey, you leave the country and we won't bomb you. The call, New York Times reported it, quickly reached an impasse as it became clear that the two sides' positions were far apart. Washington demanded that Maduro and his top allies leave Venezuela immediately to allow the restoration of democratic rule, while regime leaders proposed handing political control to the opposition but retaining command of the armed forces. According to the sources, the U.S. message to Maduro was direct: safe passage would be guaranteed for him, his wife, and his son only if he agreed to resign right away. One source said the call, viewed as a last ditch effort to avoid a direct confrontation, stalled over three issues. First, Maduro asked for global amnesty for any crimes he and his group had committed, and that was, of course, rejected, said the source. Second, they asked to retain control of the armed forces, similar to what happened in Nicaragua in 91 with Violeta Chamorro. In return, they would allow free elections. The arrangements also resembled a Cuban model that left the Ortega brothers as the real power behind the scenes and ultimately helped pave their return to government. The administration rejected that proposal as well. The third sticking point was timing. Washington insisted Maduro resign immediately, and Caracas refused. Now, of course, you know, Maduro would be absolutely nuts to believe any of these assurances. No way in the world, no way in the world would the United States allow Maduro to go somewhere and enjoy a kind of a peaceful life. That's absolutely not. The United States would hunt him down and either assassinate him or more likely abduct him, take him back to the United States, and then hold a show trial, the way they did with Noriega. I mean, Maduro knows this perfectly well. They're not gonna let it go. And Therefore, those assurances by the United States are worth nothing. So that was obvious that Maduro wasn't going to take the deal. Um, the the question is still, first of all, what happens next? Um, One has to assume that they will begin the land strikes, and but that doesn't get Maduro out. Uh, the only way you can use force to get him out, short of a direct invasion. Trump isn't going to order an invasion because that's going to be heavy in casualties. Trump doesn't want American casualties. That'd be catastrophic for him. So the only other option is to use American air power in conjunction with some indigenous radical force that was trying to overthrow Maduro. Um, they tried that in the case of Yugoslavia, where they used in 1999 they used the Kosovo Liberation Army. That was the indigenous force, and that went together with the NATO bombing. But that didn't really work because the Kosovo Liberation Army were a bunch of spastics. They couldn't fight seriously, and they were easily defeated by the Yugoslav army. And so therefore NATO really had no other option but to escalate the bombing, and then finally to threaten Milosevic. Well, we're just going to destroy completely Belgrade. I mean, we're just going to wipe it off the face of the earth. I mean, that was a direct threat issued by Marty Ahtisaari, the Finnish former Finnish prime minister. Um, but that's because the indigenous but the indigenous thing didn't work. But the thing why threatening Milosevic did work was that there was the intensity of the hatred in the West for Milosevic. You know that really everyone was just going to look the other way. You know, destroy Belgrade, fine. You know, who cares? These people are fascists, they're ethnic cleansers. You know, they're genocidaires, and so on. So that was years and years of propaganda. I mean, the propaganda against the Serbs began in well, you know, you can say in 1991, but I think probably even further. You know, when Milosevic first came to the attention of the Western media around about 1987, and that's when the demonization began. So that you have to lay the groundwork for that. So you know, to get the public to accept the bombing of a city, the bombing of a major city. The public isn't willing to accept the bombing of Caracas. I just don't think that Trump hasn't even begun to make that case. So, that's the problem. Now, I don't see any indigenous force in Venezuela with which the United States can align. So they can just keep bombing, but the bombing isn't going to get Maduro out. In fact, the bombing will only succeed in rallying the public to Maduro, and it would dissuade any treacherous fifth columnists around Maduro from taking a risk of kidnapping him and handing him over to the Americans. I mean, you know, because then you're seen to be a low life scumbag by the public, and they might kill you. So there'll be no incentive once the bombing starts for anyone to betray Maduro. Now, the indigenous thing did work with Gaddafi, but that was a long bombing campaign. I mean, it began in March of 2011, and then finally in October they managed to get Gaddafi out. So that was let's see, that was a 7-month campaign. That takes time. Um, um, so therefore, is Trump planning seven months? And I think it's going to be more difficult in Venezuela than it was in a place like Libya. So you have to think, well, that all of this is very strange. Now, the thing that may be working against um, Trump. I mean, I was thinking, up to about a day or so ago, yeah, Trump is going to go ahead and he begin this bombing. But now with this whole thing with with this possible war crime in the Caribbean, I think there's gonna be some lack of enthusiasm with going ahead with that. So if you recall, what's happened was that back in early September, um, there was when the Trump administration began hitting those vessels in the Caribbean. They hit a vessel. Oh, it's involved in drug trafficking, and they didn't really bother to provide any evidence that this is involved in drug trafficking. But of course, even if it was involved in drug trafficking, you still don't really have any right to start just shooting up boats and killing people on board. I mean, there's just no basis at all for it, because you can't really say it's an armed conflict, because it's not an armed conflict. This is drug trafficking. You can certainly um, intervene and or interdict boats that are suspected of carrying drugs. You can certainly absolutely do that. Um, And if they resist interdiction, I mean, I guess you could defend yourself. But if you're defending yourself, it has to use you have to use force proportionate to the force that's used against you. But you can't just simply say, "Well, I think that boat is carrying drugs," and then you hit it with a missile, um, and just say, "Oh, well, that's because we're in a state of war." Well, when did that happen? Did Has Congress declared war? And when has drug trafficking ever been a an armed combatant against the United States? So that was always a problem. But what added to this the issue of the Caribbean is that they hit this boat with one missile, and it was obviously quite a devastating hit. But then there was some people on the boat who were clinging to life, um, and then they were hit with a second missile. Now, if the United States had launched that second missile, and they knew that there were people, clinging to life, because trying to avoid drowning, then that would obviously be a war crime, because, of course, according to the Second Geneva Convention, which deals with um, combat on sea, there's an obligation to rescue any combatants that are stranded at sea, fighting for life. You can obviously, once you've saved their lives, you can take them into custody, but you can't just simply execute them, in effect. So, just like the first Geneva Convention deals with land war. So when you have wounded soldiers, or when you have when you you capture them, you can't then execute them. You're obligated to provide medical attention before you take them into custody. You can't just simply pick up a gun and just simply shoot them, because you think, well, they're enemy combatants, so I can just finish them off. So that's the Geneva Convention. Of course, the Geneva Convention assumes that there's this a serious armed conflict, which is that there are armed combatants on either side. But you still have to observe the Geneva Convention, even in this case, there's no the laws of war don't even really apply, because, hey, you're dealing with drug traffickers, and drug traffickers have never been deemed to be armed combatants. They're essentially this civilian criminals, and then the normal rules of policing apply, namely that you use the minimal amount of force in order to interdict suspects and then bring them to justice. But anyway, so there was this second attack. So there were two people from that boat who were kind of clinging to life, and then boom, the Americans hit them with the second strike, and obviously killed the two who were clinging to life. So this was this appeared in the Washington Post, and I mean, this is actually quite embarrassing for the United States. Now, I think the United States is going to get itself out of it. It always has. Whenever you catch them dead to rights, committing war crimes, they'll just say, "Well, we didn't see anything. We didn't know." We heard some of that with Pete Hegseth today. Fog of war. We didn't know what was going on, and so on. But let's just watch first of all. Trump was asked about that second strike, and so let's first of all let me get there. So now this is Trump asked about the second strike.
I don't know anything about it. He said he did not say that, and I believe him 100%. You don't know if there was. You're talking about the two men? The second strike to kill the two men. No, he said he didn't do it. He said he never said it. Would you be okay with that if he did? He said he didn't do it, so I don't have to make that decision. On the Venezuela boat strike, if there were a second strike that killed wounded people moving into the first strike, were you? Well, number one, I don't know that happened. And Pete said he did not want them. He didn't even know what people were talking about. So we'll look into it. But no, I wouldn't have wanted that. Not a second strike.
All right, so you can see here that Trump is obviously aware of a legal problem here. So very well that few things are as unambiguous as the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Convention basically, yeah, I mean, when somebody's wounded, you don't just then finish the job off by putting a bullet through the person's head. So say whether it's on land or on sea, when you hit a ship and then the sailors are in the water, you basically you have an obligation to save them, and you have an obligation to provide medical assistance. It's there. I mean, it's in black and white, and the Geneva Conventions are among the few international treaties that the United States has actually subscribed to. So the United States actually signed and ratified all four of the Geneva Conventions. So you can't even say, well, we never really ratified them. For instance, I mean, the protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions, that was in 1977. The United States never ratified those, signed but never ratified them. So that doesn't apply to the United States. But keep in mind that even Nazi Germany signed and ratified the Geneva Convention. So they did observe the Geneva Conventions, with the exception of the Soviet Union. And they somehow rationalized their refusal to observe the Geneva Conventions when it came to the Soviet Union by saying, well, the Soviet Union never signed or ratified the Geneva Conventions. So if the Soviet Union didn't, then we're under no obligations to observe the Geneva Conventions when it came to the Soviets. So it's not a very good argument, but that's the argument that that Nazi Germany applied, which is, well, we're not obligated to observe the Geneva Conventions in their case, because it only makes sense to observe the Geneva Conventions when both sides adhere to it. So in other words, we protect their prisoners of war and they protect ours. Now, so this is a real problem, and that's what I mean, that if this grows in magnitude, then that might cool Trump's ardor to get involved in Venezuela, because there's going to be a lot more of this kind of thing. So anyway, yesterday, Caroline Leavitt was forced to address this issue. Let's just watch how she addressed the issue.
Gabe. Regarding Venezuela, the president said yesterday that Secretary Hegseth had denied that second strike, that reported second strike on an alleged drug vote on September 2nd. The secretary said to the president that didn't happen. But to clarify, I just wanted to clear this up. In his social media post, Secretary Hegseth didn't go into details about that strike. He just said U.S. operations in the area were lawful, and he said that the story and media reports were fabricated. So to be clear, does the administration deny that second strike happened, or did it happen and the administration denies that Secretary Hegseth gave the order?
The latter is true, Abe, and I have a statement to read for you here. President Trump and Secretary Hegseth have made it clear that presidentially designated narco-terrorist groups are subject to lethal targeting in accordance with the laws of war. With respect to the strikes in question on September 2nd, Secretary Hegseth authorized Admiral Bradley to conduct these kinetic strikes. Admiral Bradley worked well within his authority and the law.
All right, so you can see here what the strategy is. The Trump administration basically is now trying to rescue Hegseth, and I think throwing Admiral Bradley under the bus. I don't think Admiral Bradley is going to get into trouble. As I say, I think that as always happens, the Americans were going to get themselves out of it. But as things stand, they're saying, "Oh, it wasn't really Hegseth. Hegseth just gave a generic order to use lethal force, but he didn't say, "Oh, kill everyone on board." He didn't say he didn't put it like that. I think that's what they're saying. Or he just said, "Yeah, use lethal force." But they're going to say, "Oh, it was Admiral Bradley that maybe that made the call to kill everyone."
Directing the engagement to ensure the boat was destroyed and the threat to the United States of America was eliminated. And I would just add one more point to remind the American public why these lethal strikes are taking place. Because this administration has designated these narco-terrorists as foreign terrorist organizations. The president has a right to take them out if they are threatening the United States of America and if they are bringing illegal narcotics that are killing our citizens at a record rate, which is what they are doing. And under the previous administration, there was enough fentanyl trafficked into our country to kill every American man.
Now, notice again, she immediately segues. This is what the Trump administration does. It segues into talking about fentanyl. But nothing that fentanyl has nothing to do with hitting these boats, because fentanyl is manufactured in laboratories in Mexico, and they're coming into the United States by land. None of that has anything to do with Venezuela, nothing to do with these boats, which they claim are ferrying drugs, but we haven't seen any evidence that they are indeed ferrying drugs.
Woman and child many times over. And so that's why you've seen a drastic difference in this administration's policy with respect to the last. And it's one of the many reasons the American public reelected this president and support this Secretary of War in conducting these strikes.
To clarify, Admiral Bradley was the one who gave that order for a second strike.
And he was well within his authority to do so.
And a separate question, the president...
So that's it. Now, Admiral Bradley was the one who gave the order for the second strike. So that's that's very important. The administration is now, boom, absolutely laid it down on him. It's not.
Said it was his intention to pardon the former president of Honduras.
All right, that's all right. That's about the Honduras. All right. So you're getting the sense here how the administration is going to play this. So if we let's take a look first of all at that original Washington Post story that about what happened. So obviously there was a whistleblower, since this happened, in early September, and here it is: Hegseth order on first Caribbean boat strike. Officials say kill them all. Now, as we'll see, this may be somewhat dubious. They wanted to make Hegseth the fall guy. That Hegseth is the one who said kill them all. But I think I think they've moved away from that claim. But particularly on this issue, as to whether he said, I specifically kill everybody on board. So I said, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gave a spoken directive. According to two people with direct knowledge of the operation, the order was to kill everybody. A missile screamed off the Trinidad coast, striking the vessel and igniting a blaze from bow to stern. For minutes, commanders watched the boat burning on a live drone feed. As the smoke cleared, they got a jolt. Two survivors were clinging to the smoldering wreck. So you have to keep in mind, this is the Washington Post claim. And then the administration is obviously is disputing that, because I think they're going to claim And I think the admiral is going to claim, well, we didn't see the survivors. So this is whatever the whistleblower is saying. As the smoke cleared, they got a jolt. 2 survivors were clinging to the smoldering wreck. I mean, if they actually saw that, if they saw those 2 survivors and then they still hit the vessel, then I think then you've got him dead to rights. I think that the admiral was going to say, no, we didn't see any survivors, but we wanted to destroy the boat. The Special Operations Commander overseeing the September the 2nd attack, the opening salvo in the Trump administration's war on suspected drug traffickers in the Western Hemisphere, ordered the second strike to comply with Hegseth's instructions. 2 people familiar with the matter said the 2 men were blown apart in the water. So this is the Post. This is the Post is going with this Hegseth. And as we'll see in a minute, the New York Times disputed this Washington Post account. So the alleged traffickers pose no immediate threat of attack against the United States and are not, as the Trump administration has tried to argue, in an armed conflict with the US. Officials and experts say, because there's no legitimate war between the 2 sides, killing any of the men in the boats amount to murder. So this is Todd Huntley, a military lawyer. And then even if the US were at war with the traffickers in order to kill all the boat's occupants, if they were no longer able to fight, would in essence be an order to show no quarter, which would be a war crime. Okay, and then they're talking. The commander overseeing the operation is this Admiral Bradley. So he told people on the secure conference call that the survivors were still legitimate targets because they could theoretically call other traffickers to retrieve them and their cargo, according to 2 people. He ordered the second strike to fulfill Hegseth's directive that everyone must be killed. So here you can see that the Post wants to make this as was Hegseth. Hegseth makes the order that everyone must be killed. Obviously, that's I mean, that clearly is an illegal order, particularly as if anyone surrenders, then you can't kill them. And then this is the New York Times story that disputed this. It says Hegseth ordered a lethal attack, but not the killing of survivors. Officials say, amid talk of war crimes, the details and precise sequence of a September the 2nd attack on a boat in the Caribbean are facing intensifying scrutiny. According to 5 U.S. officials who spoke separately and on the condition of anonymity, Mr. Hegseth, ahead of the September the 2nd attack, ordered a strike that would kill the people on the boat and destroy the vessel and its purported cargo of drugs. But, each official said, Mr. Hegseth's directive did not specifically address what should happen if a first missile turned out not to fully accomplish all of those things. And the officials said his order was not a response to surveillance footage showing that at least 2 people on the boat survived the first blast. So in other words, they're saying that his. So if you go back, what is it here that they're saying? You're saying it was spokesman Mr. Hegseth ordered a strike that would kill the people on the boat and destroy the vessel and its purported cargo of drugs. But Mr. Hegseth's directive did not specifically address what would happen if a first missile turned out not to fully accomplish all of those things. His order was not a response to surveillance footage showing that at least 2 people on the boat survived the first blast. Admiral Bradley ordered the initial missile strike and then several follow-up strikes that killed the initial survivors and sank the disabled boat. As that operation unfolded, they said, Mr. Hegseth did not give any further orders to him. The officials clarified the sequence of events amid the political and legal uproar that has followed the report in the Washington Post. It said that Admiral Bradley ordered the second strike to fulfill a directive by Mr. Hegseth to kill everyone. The reaction has included questions about whether Mr. Hegseth specifically ordered an execution of shipwrecked sailors in violation of the laws of war. And then In interviews on Monday, two U.S. officials, both of whom were supportive of the administration's boat strikes, described a meeting before the attack at which Mr. Hegseth had briefed Special Operations Forces commanders on his execute order to engage the boat with lethal force. That written order, they said, did not address what should happen if people survive the first strike. The two officials also said that Mr. Hegseth made no oral directive at the meeting that went beyond the written order. The Post article did not provide the context on when Mr. Hegseth gave what its sources described as a spoken order to kill everyone. The two officials questioned whether the surviving people were Admiral Bradley's intended target in the second strike, as opposed to the purported drugs and the disabled vessel. They argued that the purported cargo remained a threat and a lawful military target because another cartel-associated boat might have come to retrieve it. That's going to be the line of defense. So you can see the line of defense by Hegseth is going to be, well, I said that you use lethal force. I didn't say that if there are survivors, we should just simply execute the survivors. I just said use lethal force. I maybe said kill everyone, but kill everyone was just simply my way of saying use lethal force. And then Bradley, because it's Bradley who obviously made that decision to hit, because he's the one who was really in charge of the operation. Bradley will say, well, I had to make the second strike because I had to destroy the drugs. So he says Mr. Bradley's intended target were the drugs. They argued that the purported cargo remained a threat and lawful military target because another cartel-associated boat might have come to retrieve it. That's what he's going to say. Well, we'll have to see. I mean, obviously, there's there is surveillance footage, but and to show that, hey, you can actually see that there are people alive. And then you say, true, we saw people alive, but we had to destroy the drugs. It's I mean, I think the whole thing is just horrific. But what I think is that that as always happens with the United States, there's not going to be a big court martial or anything like that. I think they got I thought that they might do that in Iraq because there were a lot of events in Iraq which were extremely embarrassing. But really, what they did, for instance, with Abu Ghraib, was that they blamed it all on some very lowly prison guards. And Sergeant England, but even those lowly prison people, they walked away with a tap on the wrist. But when you watch something like this, you really get a sense, and maybe that's a clue to what Trump thinks he's doing in the case of Venezuela, because it just doesn't seem to make any sense. I mean, when we're talking about what political benefits can Trump gain from this, and what does any of this have to do with MAGA, with America First, no more stupid wars, no more endless wars. You get a sense that America envies Israel, because what that attack, you see a couple of survivors, and then you hit them with your missile and kill them. You think, well, who else does this? Well, Israel does this. Israel does this on a regular basis. People surrender and then they get shot. And then when footage emerges, and human rights people say, you basically shot unarmed men. We can see the footage. They're unarmed. You can see the footage. They've got their hands up. You basically just shot them dead who are surrendering. It's a war crime. And when Israel is caught doing this, then they say, well, we're going to have to investigate. I mean, first of all, they would deny that it happened. Then when the footage emerges, they say, well, we're going to have to investigate. And then, of course, when they say we're going to investigate, Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the rest of them scream, outrage at the idea that heroic Israeli servicemen should be under any kind of investigation. And then the investigation will say, well, everyone behaved perfectly reasonably. They had every reason to think that that these apparently unarmed men were actually armed. They thought they looked as if they were armed. So, no harm done. And they're going to do. This is what they're going to do in this case. That they're going to say, well, we didn't. First of all, they'll say we didn't see any survivors. We couldn't make out that there were any survivors. But then if they say, well, how the hell can you miss these survivors? So, well, we weren't actually hitting the survivors. Our job was to destroy the drugs. We were targeting the drugs. There was no obligation on our part to go rescue anyone. We were targeting the drugs. So that's going to be there. There's not going to be a court-martial. That's Admiral Bradley. He's not going to be court-martial. And Hegseth will survive this. And because the whole thing is so absurd. So the illegality of it is obviously so manifest that. So one other thing that I wanted to bring up is the Poland and Germany. They're supposedly the great allies when it comes to Ukraine, and they're together. We've got the Weimar Triangle and whatnot. Which is Germany, Poland, and France, and Poland is one of the big major powers in Europe and everything else. Well, anyway, but if you recall, under the previous government in Poland had put in I don't know, a $1.3 trillion or $1.5 trillion bill for all of the damages that Germany had caused to Poland in World War II. So you add on inflation and whatever. They say the bill comes to 1.5 trillion, and say, we'd like the money in used banknotes, please. Now Germany says, well, we don't owe you any damn thing. We owe you nothing, because all of these things were settled when Poland and East Germany signed a kind of a mutual waiver on claims against one another sometime in the early 1950s. And then Germany says, well, we took over East Germany, and so therefore all of the treaties signed by East Germany have now become legal and are binding on us, following the reunification. Well, the Poles aren't very happy about this. They're looking forward to 1.5 trillion. And so that was the previous government, the conservative government, the Law and Justice Party. They were the ones who were pushing this whole bill for Germany. And of course, Poland was also saying that they're going to ask for some money from Russia for the damages that they incurred from the Soviet Union. And so there was this meeting yesterday between Friedrich Merz and Donald Tusk, and here we have. It says Polish-German tensions over World War II reparations mar leaders' summit. So remember, the World War II now is it's more than 80 years since it ended. I mean, it's like there aren't really too many people alive who were alive during World War II. I mean, it's really, it's a very increasingly diminished number of population. So here's Prime Minister Donald Tusk and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz clashed over war reparations and restitution for Germany's Nazi era destruction of Poland. The open disagreement between two leaders who have vowed to mend often strained relations between their two countries cast a shadow over talks in Berlin that were meant to project unity and cooperation on a range of issues, including defense and support for Ukraine. I've got to talk about Ukraine. Why? It's Russia is the enemy. We have to. We're at war with Russia, and here you are fighting over World War II. Instead, the two leaders spent time sparring over the highly emotional issue of how Germany should attempt to make up for its actions during World War II. But Tusk, under pressure from the opposition Nationalist Law and Justice Party, took a harder line on the matter than he has in the past, criticizing Germany's logic for refusing to pay war reparations to Poland. We in Poland all believe that Poland has not received compensation for the losses and crimes of World War II, Tusk said. And then, we have this is so to pay the 1.3 trillion that the previous government asked. But on Monday, Tusk reopened the issue, criticizing the German argument that Poland waived its right to reparations in the 1950s when it was under the control of the Soviet Union. The law and justice politicians, including the current president, Karol Nawrocki, argue that the waiver was made under Soviet pressure and can't be taken at face value. On Monday, Tusk echoed that line. Germany is adhering to this formal diplomatic agreement from the 1950s. Those who know history know that in the 1950s, Poland had no say in the matter, and Poland's waiver of reparations is not seen as an act that reflects the opinion of the Polish people. The Polish people had no say. Now, the problem with this argument is that, well, does that mean that Poland doesn't accept any of the agreements that it signed under the communist government? Because that becomes very interesting. Does that mean that Poland doesn't accept its eastern border? That therefore, since that was signed by the communist government, that which formalized the redrawing of Poland's borders after World War II. So it doesn't accept that. It doesn't accept any of the agreements that it signed, even with West Germany in the Willy Brandt and the Ostpolitik. I mean, is everything up? By making this argument that this was done under the communists, and therefore the Poles had no say in it, and therefore has no legal validity. That becomes very interesting. So we have Poland, which could very soon become a very lawless state. You remember we had Poland recently justifying the blowing up of infrastructure, any infrastructure anywhere that helps Russia. Now Poland apparently says that any of the agreements that it signed, international agreements that it signed under the communist rule, has no legal force because the Polish people had no say in the matter. This is a completely ridiculous argument. No one has ever made such an argument, or just because it wasn't a democracy. Obviously, it wasn't a democracy. But most countries in the world are not democracies. Nonetheless, the agreements that they sign are regarded as legally binding. Now, I don't think Germany is going to give anything to Poland. I mean, that's not what Germany does. Germany has never paid any reparations for what it did in World War II. It's given money to Israel. It's also given paid restitution to individuals. The German is not that individuals can make restitution claims, but Germany has never paid money to countries for the damages that they suffered as a result of the German attack. So Tusk isn't going to get anything out of the Germans, but it's very amusing that in this moment when they're all supposed to be united against uh, Putin, and of course united against Trump, and of course united on behalf of Kiev. There they are squabbling about World War II, and it's particularly pointless and futile because Germany is not going to give anything. So just bringing this up when you know the answer, it does seem a very foolish step. Anyway, let's take a look at our locals page and address some of the issues raised by the gagglers, the people who really care about the upkeep of the dogs and the mood of the dogs, because it's the dogs who really make this the Gaggle a going enterprise. So that it's very very important and very very grateful for all of the Gagglers who come and try to contribute to the upkeep of the dogs. So thank you so much. And uh, yeah, okay. So the first one is Robert, and Robert, always very good to see you. Thank you very much for your generosity. And so Robert says, "Good evening, George. Good evening. Now, if, as the EU argues, Putin is a dictator exercising illegitimate control over the 140 billion euro sovereign fund, then wouldn't justice be by way of returning to the funds to the rightful owner, the Russian people?" Yes, your logic is impeccable. If a bank president embezzles depositors' funds, what good does it do depositors for the government to seize the embezzled funds in order to punish the bank president? Yeah, that you're absolutely right. So if you embezzle depositors' funds, then yeah, you obviously you should be punished for that. But the most important thing that needs to be addressed is precisely that the depositors must be made good, because it's their money. As you say, what good does it do depositors for the government to seize the embezzled funds in order to punish the bank president? Yeah, no, absolutely. The logic is impeccable, but they don't really apply logic. I mean, the view of the EU is that they want to just get their hands on money. They need money badly. I mean, they just can't. They don't have anything else. There just isn't any more funds that is needed. I mean, they got to keep this war going for another 2-3 years, which is what their plan is. That's it's a lot of money, and where is it going to come from? I mean, they've tried various options. Oh, well, let's increase the borrowing limit, but that, of course, comes into conflict with EU debt stipulations. You got the debt has to be within EU guidelines. I mean, I guess they could get around that, but the problem is that the countries don't have any money. They're just they that and they're already running up debts. So running up even bigger debts is going to be it's a serious issue. So that 140 billion euros is very nice kind of money that's lying around, and they want to put it to use. Now, the, what they've done so far is they claim, oh, this is all legal and above board, and this is actually quite amusing because they because in fact, let me just show you. In fact, it's not looking good for the Europeans, because they had some. Let me just find this. Yeah, that they had some bad news here. That first of all, there was the issue of, as we talked about before, is that Belgium is saying, look, fine, we can sign off on you helping yourself to the 140 billion euros in Euroclear, but then we have to have absolute cast iron guarantees that you're going to make this, that the rest of Europe is going to make good on this money, because the Russians are going to come after us and they're going to want the money back. So we want, we want cast iron guarantees that if that happens, and it's not if, but when that happens, you will make good on this 140 billion. And then the Europeans say, well, no, we can't really, we'll see what happens then and there. And anyway, don't worry about anything, because they're not going to come after you. And we've got a legal document. We have a legal document to show that our case is very strong. But here we have this story. It's in today's Politico, which says that EU countries reject blank check guaranteed to Belgium over Russian assets loan. And so they said Belgian PM Bart de Wever is asking EU countries to guarantee the risk of the scheme over an indefinite period of time. Well, and then European governments are accusing Belgium, they're also accusing somebody, of making excessive demands for a blank check protection. It's a blank check. They're saying, hey, we don't want to be stuck with owing 140 billion euros and being chased around from court to court throughout the world, and our reputation damaged beyond repair. The government's reluctance could derail negotiations on an EU plan to lend those immobilized assets to Ukraine ahead of a crunch summit in December. And then the European Commission is on the verge of unveiling the legal framework. The legal framework. I mean, they don't have, if you want a legal framework, go to the International Court of Justice and get a legal opinion on this. Is it legal to seize in other countries' sovereign assets against that country's will? Is that legal? And, it's going to take them 10 minutes to come up with a ruling and saying, no, it is not legal. Sovereign assets, according to all international understanding, according to all international treaties, sovereign assets are untouchable. You cannot touch those. And then, amid fears of Russian retaliation, Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever insists that the EU governments give Belgium cover with financial guarantees that exceed the 140 billion and that can be paid out within days. He says, yeah, you got to be ready now. That you're going to set this up. In other words, put 140 billion in escrow so that when the Russians come, that money is already available. He also wants the lifespan of these guarantees to outlast the EU sanctions against Russia. And then, while European governments are open to guaranteeing a pre-agreed figure, they are reluctant to sign up for what they describe as a blank check. In other words, they agree in principle. Yeah, sure, we'll make good. We'll give you the money. Sure, now let's go get a drink. But they, blank check. In other words, yeah, put some money in escrow now, and then we'll, then in other words, that money will be available right away. But they're not going to do that. For EU diplomats or Politico, they cannot accept de Wever's request because it would put their country's financial viability at the whim of a court ruling. But it's okay for Belgium to be, humiliated by a court ruling, potentially exposing them to billions of euros of repayment years after the war in Ukraine ends. Yeah. That's what Belgium is trying to avoid. And then if the guarantees are infinite and without limits, then what are we getting ourselves into? Yeah, quite. For many members, it's politically difficult to give this blank check. And then here is the more bad news for this plan. Today, the European Central Bank says refuses to provide a backstop for the $163 billion Ukraine loan. The European Central Bank has refused to backstop for the 140 billion euro payments to Ukraine, undermining an EU plan to raise a reparations loan backed by frozen Russian assets. And then the ECB concluded the European Commission proposal violated its mandate, the newspaper said, citing multiple officials, adding to Brussels' difficulties in raising the loan against Russian central bank assets. And then basically ECB holds back on loans to Ukraine with Russian assets, and then because it says, um, this, what they're saying, how they put it, under the Commission's plan, it would be up to member states to provide guarantees against the risk of reimbursement to Euroclear. However, the British newspaper reported this morning the claims of several EU officials that European chancelleries would not be able to provide rapid financial cover. No, I don't think they could in the event of an emergency, and that therefore, to avoid unsettling the markets, the Commission would ask the European Central Bank to act as a lender of last resort for Euroclear. And then this Financial Times reports that the European Central Bank concluded that the European Commission's proposal violates its mandate. So the European Central Bank is saying, nope, we're not going to do it either because, hey, that's, we're not going to act as a lender of last resort. So Ursula von der Leyen is really going to have to apply some serious pressure. I think what they'll probably try to do is threaten this Belgian prime minister. They're going to suggest that they've got evidence that he's been embezzling funds. Maybe they've got some evidence that pedophilia. There've been some pedophile scandals in Belgium over the years. Maybe they've got some footage of him. I can't see at the moment how else they can apply pressure. This is it's unraveling, right in front of their eyes. So I think they're going to have to see if they can do the just try to blackmail him to get him to play along. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. Really appreciate your generosity. Now, Summer Petros, good to see you, Summer Petros. Summer Petros is, I see him, here in Hungary. His Hungarian is amazing, so that's no easy language. That so I'm always in awe of people who speak Hungarian fluently. Anyways, Summer Petros says, George, to return to a theme mentioned in your previous live stream, the show trials and power struggle between the various communists in the early 1950s in Hungary, I didn't realize that Reich was also Jewish. Yeah. Secondly, you mentioned that Rákosi was swapped for various historical Hungarian flags in 1943. In fact, the swap happened in 1940 when the Horthy government first established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Sadly, by 1943, relations were not so good. Well, that may be 1940, but then in that case, thinking about this, well, you may be 1925. You may be right about that. It was 1940 that that Rákosi came to the swap that took place with between the communists in exchange for the flags. That may well have been in 1940 that took place. You're right that in 1943 relations between Hungary and the Soviet Union were not good. However, it should be pointed out that Hungary was indeed making peace feelers to Stalin in 1943, because after Stalingrad and the terrible losses that the Hungarians fought at Stalingrad, and the terrible losses that the Hungarians suffered, Hungary wanted out of the war. I mean, they just couldn't take this. The casualties were just so horrendous that Hungary wanted out of the war, and they did put out feelers to Stalin to get out. I mean, Hungary put out feelers also to the Western powers, but clearly they wanted to get out. So I guess that was around 1943-44 that Hungary was seriously putting out feelers to the Soviet Union and to the Allied powers to get out. The swap, the 1940. I think that was in 1940 that that the so I mean 39 the 39-41 period was a period in which, oh, this was the détente between the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and so therefore um, that applied to an ally, and Hungary was an ally of Nazi Germany, so that would apply to an ally, and therefore it would have been reasonable for Stalin to make the swap in exchange for all of the Hungarian communists. Rákosi spent many years in prison. I mean, that was, you think about, he's, it's almost 20 years he was in prison. And, that's no fun. But yeah, he came to he came to Moscow. My father met him there, and that's why Rákosi was in a way. I mean, putting it this like he was a friend of the family. He wasn't quite a friend of the family, but he always had good relations with my father. Um, anyway, then Cynthia, always very good to see you, Cynthia. Really appreciate all of your contributions. You say, yesterday Peter suggested that you should you should be a co-host with us, which is maybe we'll do that one day. But Cynthia, of course, is our film expert. With an amazing encyclopedic knowledge of film and cinema history, and also an amazing knowledge of the aesthetics of film, editing, music, and cinematography, everything. She knows a great deal about all of that, and she uh, provides us gagglers with this huge amount of information that accompanies our weekly screenings, and so you can always enjoy the screening and take a delight in Cynthia's informative commentary that accompanies it. So yesterday we screened Orson Welles' last completed film, F for Fake, and Cynthia almost outdid herself with providing so much really, really interesting and just fascinating information about the film. I don't know if I would exactly recommend the film. I mean, it's as always with Wells, there's a lot of interesting things there, and but yeah, I mean, it's always worth watching Wells. But whether it works as a film, that's up to individuals to decide. Does this work as a film or not? And so, I mean, but I think that's the thing with Wells is that yes, there are lots. It has a lot of interesting moments, but whether it kind of adds up to a film, that's I don't know, that's I think debatable. But anyway, be that as it may, Cynthia provides a really interesting commentary to go with that film. So watch the film. It's there. It's on our locals board, and as you watch, read Cynthia's commentary. Anyway, Cynthia then says Putin ought to put a bug in Trump's ear about developing the Trump tunnel under the Bering Strait as a way to redirect Trump's focus from violence and destruction toward constructive, productive activities. Yeah. Then again, Trump will probably have the tunnel blown up, just like Biden did to Nord Stream pipelines. Then he'll falsely blame it on the Russians, with the pernicious goal of prolonging the war in Ukraine. Well, that's very interesting because I don't think Trump sees the war in Ukraine in the way that Biden did, and I don't think he sees it in the way that NATO sees it. I think Biden and NATO, want this war to go on. They absolutely want this to go on indefinitely. The goal is to inflict strategic defeat on Russia, to oust Putin, to throw him out of power, and then ultimately to break Russia up, break it up into small bits and pieces, all the different territories and autonomous oblasts and everything else, just break it all up. And this was of course spelled out by the Kayakalas, this horrible creature that we like to address. But she said it, yeah, we should, Russia's made up a lot of small nations, and we can just break it up, and all these small nations are going to set up their own state, and then there'll be very little left of Russia. She was rejoicing, and there's no question that that is a strategy among many within Europe. Biden, I think, just wanted to destroy Russia and destroy Putin. He's always had a kind of hatred for Putin. Like goes all the way back when in 2012, when he met Putin and told him, "Hey, don't come back. You're not supposed to come back to power." Now Trump, I think, is a little different because I think he sees China as the real threat. It's a long-term threat to the United States, a threat to American economic and political hegemony, which Russia isn't. He doesn't take Russia seriously as an economic and financial power. Militarily, he could take it seriously, but even now, he probably thinks that Russia isn't really militarily that strong. However, it is rich in resources. Has a huge landmass, and with American ingenuity and American entrepreneurship, those resources could be exploited. And I think he sees this as somehow that some kind of an economic partnership would be to America's advantage, and I think he sees it that America and Russia together against China. I don't think that's not going to happen. Russia's not going to abandon China. I mean, China's not going to abandon Russia. I mean, that just isn't going to happen. But I think Trump thinks that he can do it. So you could see how the tunnel idea would appeal to him. I'm not sure it's ever going to get off the ground, but Dmitriev, and he was the one who kind of floated this idea. Hey, because he thought this is the kind of thing Trump would get excited about. He's a builder, and he's an entrepreneur, and he wants to make money, and that's what he's been devoted his whole life to. So this would appeal to him, and he made that pitch. Dmitriev made that pitch, particularly that Elon Musk would somehow finance this, and so that he thought this would appeal to Trump, and he probably does appeal to Trump. And he, he just says, yeah, there's money to be had there. And I think that he really does think about, right. He doesn't see Russia. He never has seen Russia as an enemy, as an adversary, as someone that America should be in any kind of a war with. So that's, I think, one thing. And I think that's different from a Cold Warrior, a man mired in the Cold War and the way Biden was. So I think Trump does have a different outlook. The problem is that unless he gets his hands around this, I think unless he's really willing to cut Ukraine off and therefore cut off NATO, then the war will go on. There's going to be no change at all. The war will go on as it went on under Biden. There'll be no change in policy. And if there's no change in policy, there's not going to be there'll be no tunnel built. I mean, the whole idea of tunnels and exploitation of the Arctic, extraction of rare earths, and all of this is predicated upon the war coming to an end. I mean, if the war doesn't come to an end, then there's not going to be any business deals. There's not going to be any. No one's going to invest any money in those circumstances. So, I agree. I think it would be great. All of these projects would be great. I think a tunnel under the Bering Strait is a great idea. I mean, people have been talking about this for more than 100 years, and I think it does appeal to Trump. But I just don't think it's going to happen. Um, so anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Cynthia goes on, hate to say it, George, but Trump always seems to find a way to pervert something good and turn it into a force of destruction. Yeah. Anyways, I wasn't able to post any photos of the movie chat yesterday, but I was able to go back and post them all today. Well, that's great. But I think the reason for that was there was a problem with locals because, as I explained in my in the notice, is that I wasn't able to upload my my copy of the film F for Fake, so we had to use the YouTube link, which isn't the same thing. So I think it was a locals problem, and I think that problem has now been solved. So I'm looking forward to going back and seeing these photos. So thank you so much, Cynthia. And again, let me repeat: please watch the movie F for Fake and read, and enjoy Cynthia's commentary. Dale Owens, good to see you, Dale. And Dale says, George, what do you think? What do you make of Irving's argument? That's David Irving's argument that 1956 in Hungary began as an anti-Jewish revolt. Any truth to it? Well, I think there's part of it is true, but I think he grossly exaggerates it. I think that the the identification of Jews and communists was very explicit when he came to the 1919 Hungarian Soviet Republic. I mean, and that was in a way a kind of an indigenous movement. I mean, here these Hungarian communists who took power. 95% of them were Jews, and so when it was overthrown, and it ruled with some brutality, as communists are wont. They were expropriating from the peasants and were putting down brutally any rebellions against the rule of the communists. So once it came to an end after 4.5 months, there was a reckoning, but not just with the communists, but with the Jews. The Jews were blamed for the 1919 Soviet Republic. Then you move the clock forward in 40 years. So 40 years now elapsed, and the communists are back in power. But this time it's a little different because now the communists are in power. And while there's a very high preponderance of the Jews, but this time they're really in power because of the Red Army. I mean, they're inserted into power by the Red Army. So the hostility that the Hungarians had towards the communists was the hostility towards a regime imposed by the Red Army. So there were anti Semitic aspects to it, but it was not really that. It was much more a kind of Hungarian uprising against alien rule. I mean, I think that this was a communist regime imposed by a foreign power. So I think David Irving deliberately, he's very inflammatory, and so he deliberately wanted to make it about the Jews, and of course then this was picked up, when I remember when the book came out, and of course everyone picked up on this. Hey, we were under the impression that these Hungarians were the good guys. All these years, people were saying, "Oh, the Hungarians, 1956, they were heroes. Everyone loved the Hungarians." All of a sudden, up until then, no one had ever liked the Hungarians. But after 56, in the West, everyone really admired the Hungarians. You remember in 1956, the Time magazine's Man of the Year was the Hungarian freedom fighter. So everyone loved the Hungarians, and then Irving writes this book, and he said, "Oh, they were all driven by anti-Semitism. It was all against. They were driven by hatred of the Jews." And so that was obviously it was a sensational thing. But but I just don't think it's right. And I think Irving always does this. He's always trying to be inflammatory, trying to make himself the trying to make a splash, and I think that he really exaggerates it. So yes, it's true. What that would have been true about the 1919 Soviet Republic. The hostility, the intense hatred of the communists after 1919 was indeed, there was a lot of very strong anti-Semitic elements to it, and they absolutely the Hungarians took out their rage and their hatred against the Jews in the years immediately after 1919. But then things calmed down, but under Horthy, and Horthy kind of brought that to an end. The sort of the anti-Semitic pogroms, they came to an end during the 1920s. But by 1956, I just don't think that was really a thing. I mean, I think the Hungarians explicitly made this about a kind of national heroism, national revival. The problem that argument is, and I think Hungarians never really, still to this day, not appreciated it, is that the Hungarians kind of, they went to war against the Soviet Union. They took part in the invasion of the Soviet Union. They fought on the side of Germany at Stalingrad. When you go to war and then you lose a war, you get hit, you get punished. And while there's no question the communist rule, particularly the communist rule of the late 1940s, early 1950s, this was the rule of Rákosi. That was pretty nasty. I mean, no question that was hated. But nonetheless, it was a punishment for choosing the wrong side in the war, and there's always retribution to be had there. So. So that that's why also that they making this a kind of national heroism and so on. Like "Arise, O Magyar," with the famous poem by Petőfi, which was recited at the start of the uprising. "Arise, O Magyar." It was, I don't know, there was a little bit ahistorical. Anyway, so I just think that Irving was inflammatory, and then when he wrote things like, which again was picked up by the media, something like he said this about Rákosi, that I think Rákosi's had the face of a kosher butcher. Something, it really was a. I mean, he particularly went off, about the physical ugliness of the communists, against very much, emphasizing the kind of Jewish looks and so on. So, anyway, so thank you so much, Dale. And Steve Keenan says, "Could ask my question from yesterday again," and then Steve Keenan says, "Well, I don't know what was the question. I mean, you asked several questions. I think we answered some of them, maybe not all of them. Anyway, it says Putin says ready for war against Europe if attacks on Russian tankers, energy continue." Well, the attacks on the tankers so far, he's blaming Ukraine. Let me just. Let me bring that up, because that was he addressed this issue today. No, sorry. Yeah, he addressed the issue today about the tankers, but it was very much about about the thanks. There's always this problem. Let me just pull this up. Okay, now. So yeah, just what he said about the tankers. So, so he's asked please comment on the attacks on tankers off the coast of Turkey. Just today, another such incident occurred. And then Putin says, frankly, I haven't even received the information yet. I know this has happened, attacks on tankers in neutral waters or even in non-neutral waters, but in the special economic zone of another state, a third state. This is piracy, nothing less. The Ukrainian armed forces, have tried to strike our seaports before. We responded. We didn't initiate these operations with similar strikes. I assure you that they are far more effective and powerful. And this primarily concerned those vessels, ships that were delivering military property, equipment, and ammunition to Ukraine. So it says, we haven't done that. Well, that does raise the question, why didn't you do that? So it says, they tried to strike, we responded, we didn't initiate with similar strikes. And it says, and this primarily concerns those vessels, ships that were delivering military property, equipment, and ammunition to Ukraine. And we hit exactly where we wanted, as evidenced by the secondary explosions we observed through aerial reconnaissance. But what the Ukrainian armed forces are doing now is piracy. And then what countermeasures might we take? First, we will expand the range of our strikes against port facilities and ships, calling at Ukrainian ports. Second, if this continues, we will consider, I'm not saying we will do this, but we will consider the possibility of retaliatory measures against the vessels of those countries that assist Ukraine in carrying out these piracy operations. So he's suggesting here that we will consider the possibility of retaliatory measures against vessels of those countries that assist Ukraine in carrying out those piracy operations. So there is, obviously, he is suggesting that he is going to hit ships delivering, I guess, military hardware to Ukrainian ports. And he's saying those countries assist Ukraine in carrying out these piracy operations. So therefore, if they if they carry out these piracy operations, he will attack the ships of third countries. The problem is that he has made these threats before, and this seems a quite tentative kind of a threat. In other words, he's saying, if this continues, we will consider, I'm not saying we will do this, but we will consider the possibility of retaliatory measures against the vessels of those countries that assist Ukraine in carrying out these piracy operations. And then the most radical option is to cut Ukraine off from the sea. So that would suggest that he's got in mind to take Odessa. That's a major operation to take Odessa. Big operation. Odessa is very heavily fortified. Then piracy would be impossible in principle. But this is all escalating. I hope that the Ukrainian military and political leadership, as well as those who stand behind them, will consider whether this practice is worth continuing. So that's where he's clearly thinking that, I mean, obviously, the issue of Odessa, and that's obviously been discussed for for a long time, and it certainly makes absolute sense. If you got to take Odessa, and therefore basically just cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. I mean, obviously, what with all these statements, Putin is saying, whatever this deal is that we're discussing with Witkoff, it's better to take the deal because the longer this war goes on, the worse it's going to get for you. And I think that's true to a certain extent. I think that yes, as far as Ukraine goes, the war is going to get worse and worse. But why I think continuing with this war, why I don't agree with that policy, or let's just continue with this war, because I think it's also very dangerous. I think it's going to be dangerous for Russia, because you just don't know what the Americans might do. There are all sorts of perilous um, actions that the United States may undertake. So it can be quite dangerous. But there's no question, and that's what Putin is saying here, is that, well, if this continues, we may start hitting the ships of third countries, and then we may even cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. But he hasn't so far. So far, Russia has not taken the path of extending the war beyond the territory of Ukraine. So anyway, Summer Petra says, I consulted the David Irving book Uprising on this. In this narrative, Janos Kadar's name survives unscathed. However, other names are Angloized, hence the Hungarian political class is populated with names such as Paul, Francis, Stephen. And unluckily, Imre Nagy does not undergo a name change in his first name to Emmerich or even Henry. Yeah, no, I think that was the peculiarity of the book, that he gives everybody a kind of an English sounding name rather than, the Hungarian. So, if you have somebody who's Ferenc, well, Ferenc is Francis, but it seems odd to refer to a Hungarian like Francis. I mean, if he's living in the UK, fine, you can, if he wants to be called Francis, then call him Francis. But let's say, Alexander, okay, the Hungarian form of Alexander is Shandor. No, okay, I mean, if Shandor wants to go and live in England, and then he wants an anglicized name, he'll say, okay, then you would say Alexander. But if you're a Hungarian living in Hungary, it's very odd to be referred to as Alexander rather than Shandor. Yeah, so Steve K9, I think the link is there from Zero Hedge. That just talks about obviously what we just discussed about what Putin and his in his news conference. Samba Petros, thank you so much for the dogs. Really appreciate that. That's good. And then Steve K9 says, Putin ready for war against Europe if Europe attacks on Russian tankers. And then Energy continue, Russia is not planning to fight European countries, but if Europe starts a war, Russia is ready right now. Yeah, that's what we talked about. The Russian thing. But if Europe starts a war with Russia soon, there will be no one left to negotiate. He warned over several EU and NATO officials have lately issued hawkish words of threat. The problem is, I think, that what he when he says these things, I mean, and there's nothing new about these statements. He's often threatened war, and of course Medvedev makes this much more explicit. Is that no one really believes these threats. I mean, people will only believe you if you act on them. That doesn't mean that he won't at some point act on these threats, but at the moment, he's just issuing threats, and basically for now almost 4 years, the Europeans have been directly involved in this war. I mean, they don't make any secret of it. They'd be directly involved, and every step of the way, they're actively involved on the side of Ukraine, and Putin hasn't really done anything about that. So, so that's why it's interesting what he said today, but I don't know whether this is any more serious than the threats he issued last November when he did the Oreshnik, and then he talks about how if a country is making deep strikes, Ukraine is making deep strikes inside Russian territory and is getting provided assistance by a nuclear power, when that could trigger a nuclear response. In other words, he said that could trigger a nuclear response. So, but nothing really happened about that. So, I'm just always a little wary of getting too excited by Putin's latest pronouncements. Here is Marty. Always good to see you, Marty. Thank you so much. And it's got hand on the heart of Steve Witkoff. It's very interesting. Witkoff is actually a very he's a very successful businessman. I mean, not as successful as Trump is, but he's very successful, very rich man. So he obviously, I mean, he looks kind of quite benign, but he's not all that benign, to be that successful. He owns a golf club and so on. So, but Marty was very interesting because Marty posted some really intriguing postings apropos of F for fake. I mean, some interesting essays about Orson Welles' last years in Hollywood. They were kind of sad, because he was like already an exhausted volcano, so to speak, and he spent his time going on all the talk show circuit. He would be on Johnny Carson and so on. It was kind of a little bit of a sad end to a great career. So Marty posted some interesting essays about the last years of Orson Welles. I have to say, I wasn't fully aware of just how heavy Welles had become, because normally you just see him sitting down, but according to this essay by Gore Vidal that Marty posted yesterday, Welles was something like 400 pounds towards the end of his life. 400 pounds. I mean, yeah, he was a big man, but 400 pounds, that is and in fact, if you're 400 pounds, it's a wonder that he managed to live to the age of 70. I mean, he certainly did not live a very healthy lifestyle, but he managed to reach the age of 70, which is quite extraordinary. And then, but Marty also posted something interesting about, since we're on the subject of fakes and hoaxes, the story of the Hitler Diaries, which is very interesting. I mean, to revisit that amazing hoax from the early 1980s, when major media publications were taken in by a pretty lousy hoax. I mean, it was fairly obvious that it was fake. But Stern magazine, leading news magazine in Germany, paid out a lot of money for the Hitler Diaries, and then of course Times newspapers was already under Rupert Murdoch then. They shelled out a lot of money, and it turned out to be an absolute total fake and fraud. So a lot of people lost some money there. But it was a very bad forgery. And well, not so much a forgery, but it was a bad fake. And then you say, well, okay, and that I think highlights the issue of fakery. Why do people allow themselves to be conned? Well, because there's money to be had. Stern and Rupert Murdoch figured that they can make a lot of money because of the sensational nature of this discovery, Hitler's diaries. Wow, this it's a historic document and so on. So everyone was going to read it. And I think that really gets to the issue of these art forgeries, which is what F for fake is about. Because the point about the art forgeries is, well, why is it that these art experts are fooled by them? Oh, yeah, that's a Modigliani. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's a Picasso. Yeah. Well, because they make money on it. If an art dealer says, yeah, I think that's a genuine Picasso, he sells it and he makes a lot of money. If you then turn around, oh, well, that was a forgery, that wasn't a real Picasso, he said, well, okay, well, I thought it was. But by then, he will already have made a lot of money. And so that's the thing about fakes is they proliferate because some people are going to make a lot of money on it, and people want to be fooled because they can still make money even though they've been fooled, even though they've been made to look ridiculous. Rupert Murdoch didn't suffer any damage to his reputation by shelling out huge sums of money on an obvious nonsense like a Hitler diary. Hugh Trevor Roper did suffer. He did damage his reputation by endorsing, at least initially, the Hitler diaries. But to be fair to him, he was lied to by Stern. Um, but nonetheless, he shouldn't have allowed himself to be fooled in that way. But Murdoch doesn't care. Murdoch doesn't care that he damaged Hugh Trevor Roper's reputation. Murdoch, he made some money. Stern made some money, but just in the initial phases, people would, they read the diaries. I mean, it was just it was such a sensation. So that's how fakery thrives, and I guess that's the theme of the film. Anyway, thank you so much, Marty. Um, and then here, as Marty has another picture. Let's see who's this picture. Um, this I. Who's the woman with the helmet? Is that our friend Kaya Callas? Hard to recognize because she's wearing dark glasses and got this gigantic helmet on her. So it could be Kaya Callas, it could be somebody else. I would plump for Kaya Callas because she really gets off on doing anything military and playing around with guns and so on. And Steve K. Nash says Russia needs victory and not negotiations. Yeah, easy for me to say since my relatives are not dying. Well, you're right. Russia needs victory. Absolutely correct. But the question is, well, how far away are we from victory? So you say, okay, well, they've taken Pokrovsk. Okay, they've taken Pokrovsk. That took a lot of doing. That was not an easy undertaking. And they've got Kupiansk. Okay, they've got that. How long is it going to take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk? Okay, I don't know. I mean, if that's going to take another 2 years, that's serious casualties. And as I say, if the war goes on for another 2-3 years, it's always dangerous. There's always unpredictability. You don't have to be Clausewitz. Clausewitz, of course, made this a cardinal element of his book, which is war is very unpredictable, and that's what makes it dangerous. So we just don't know what may happen. So yeah, Russia needs victory, yes, but we should have had that victory already some time ago. It should have been done, now. So I wouldn't have a problem with just bringing it to an end. Russia walks away with something. Does that mean the war starts up again in 10-15 years? I guess. But maybe that's just the way it is in the world. There are no perfect solutions. That it's just you just have to make do with compromises. Not good. I'd rather you didn't, but that's the way it is. Anyway, Steve then says the Maduro mystery. This has to be emotion over something, since it makes little rational sense. Yeah, I agree with that. I think Rubio's role in it, and I think also, as I said earlier, and I'm beginning to come around to this way of thinking, that there's some kind of envy that Trump has for Israel. I think he envies that Israel just does these things. Israel just goes ahead, thumps somebody. It doesn't care about world opinion. It doesn't care about the casualties it inflicts. It doesn't care the pain that it inflicts on others. It just says, well, we had to do it because we had to do it. The only thing that matters is our security. The only thing that matters is, we don't get inundated with narcotics. And when you tell them, hey, the Venezuela plays almost no role in the international narcotics trade. I say, well, I don't care. So just like Israel. Israel just says, well, we don't care. Hey, they were negotiating a ceasefire. You killed negotiators. Well, we don't care. They were scum, so we killed them. So you see, like this thing with Maduro. I mean, Maduro is giving America everything, and Trump is still refusing. But it seems like Maduro. I mean, I'm only going by that Miami Herald story, so I don't know whether that's true. But according to that Miami Herald story, Maduro is willing to step down. And he said, okay, well, but he expects to be, at least to have the army. He will, say we'll have civilian leadership. The opposition can take over the government, but he would still want to have the military under his control. Trump said no. And it says, well, what about amnesty? There'll be no prosecutions. Trump said no. So he's already, Maduro is willing to step down, but Trump refuses. And I think he'd probably say, yeah, that's what Netanyahu would do. Netanyahu would also refuse any deals. And let's go back. And yeah. Anne-Marie, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, as always, for your generosity. And as I always say, Anne-Marie is our, distinguished musician among us. Just amazingly enough, plays with some of the finest orchestras in the world and plays with extraordinarily distinguished composers and musicians. And she also allows us to enjoy her musical insights. The insights won by being an outstanding musical practitioner. So it's always such a pleasure to have Anne-Marie here, and particularly when she has time to lend us her musical expertise and comments on the musical pieces that we publish as part of the Music Club. I posted something from Alban Berg, Alban Berg's lyric suite. I know Alban Berg isn't everyone's cup of tea. I know there'll be some people saying we're not happy with Alban Berg, but I think it's worth listening to. And I hope at some point, Anne-Marie, you'll just if you have time, say something about what about Berg and what it's like to play Alban Berg, which I would assume is very difficult. But anyway, thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Really appreciate your generosity and appreciate your the musical knowledge that you impart for us. So thank you. And then Robert says, before the 1960s, Latin America was portrayed as poor but harmless, a sleepy region, one pitied, not feared, but with a US-led war on drugs, prohibition created inflated cartels into militarized powers, corrupted governments, and transformed the entire region's image into a dangerous narco frontier. One could argue the policy created the very crisis it claimed to fight. Well, I suppose I mean, I do think, and I think, Robert, we've had the disagreements. I do think there is a national interest to fight drug addictions, and that is a serious issue. It is destructive of people's lives. I think it's destructive of societies. And United States is suffering from it. Russia suffers from it. A lot of countries suffer from a serious drug addiction. Now, of course, the causes of drug addiction are numerous, but I don't think the solution consists of just simply saying, okay, well, we're going to turn, that's it. We're just going to give up and let the drugs flow and let people do whatever they want to do. Just take drugs and so on. I think that's a terrible way to deal with a problem. I mean, that's just giving up, and I think it'll be wholly destructive for society. So I think it's right to fight against proliferation of drugs, Um, but how all the different ways that one has to fight it. I mean, that's more complicated. But I do know that just simply um, allowing it, and then obviously have to live with the destructive consequences, and somebody still has to pay for it, because of the influence of the drug. Somebody has to pay for the health costs. Somebody has to pay for all of the societal destruction. It's not going to be for free. Because if people get sick and die from drugs, they're still going to get medical treatment. Somebody's still going to have to pay for it. So I don't, I just I'm not never been convinced by the libertarian argument. But the 1960s, of course, why? Up until the 1960s, I think most people thought of Latin America as kind of America's backyard, and so and no one really thought worried too much about it. They said, well, basically, the United States runs Latin America. It's your backyard. You got United Fruit. They run Guatemala. The America's corporations run Latin America for the benefit of the United States. I mean, what I think caused the sudden panic when it came to Latin America was Castro. I mean, the Castro coming to power in Cuba, and that moment, I think the United States got very concerned that Castroism was going to spread throughout Latin America, and they're still worried about it. I mean, they still haven't let go of it. I mean, there's still Cuba is under embargo, even though the Castros have gone, but Cuba is still under an American embargo. There's still fear that somehow communism spread by Cuba, is the virus that will sweep away American hegemony in Latin America. So I think that's what made Latin America of interest to the United States, and Americans then became really very actively involved, you know, in coups, and then overthrowing governments, and fighting the drug cartels and everything else. There's always that fear that somehow America will lose control of Latin America to the communists. Anyway, thank you, Robert. And then Cynthia says, to ensure no survivors could expose the truth of their innocence, the U.S. military had to carry out a second strike on the boat. At least that's my explanation for this. I think that's reasonable. I you know I mean, they have captured some people when they've hit the boats in the past. They've hit the boats and they have captured them. But what they did with those survivors is they sent them back to their own countries, which was very strange, because if you're saying that these are drug dealers, drug traffickers, then why wouldn't you want to arrest them, take them to the United States, and put them on trial? So yeah, I mean, that perfectly reasonable to say, yeah, they wanted to kill them survivors so that there'd be you know dead men tell no tales. But I think it's just simply a kind of this brutality. I do think it's this this Trump and Hexeth, they get off on this kind of cruelty and brutality, and I think that's what I mean. It goes back to Israel. I mean, this is the way Israel would handle these problems. So we got to imitate how Israel would do these things. Richard Phillips says, another great masterful soliloquy. Oh, I've been talking in YouTube chat because I felt ranty and I didn't want to annoy people here. Okay. No, you're certainly not annoying people here. So thank you so much, Richard Phillips. It is hard not to come to the conclusion that the left was right and Trump really is just plain stupid. Well, I wouldn't have said he is stupid exactly. I think I would say the left was right that Trump doesn't really take seriously all of the things that he supposedly cared so much about, all the talk about we got to address domestic problems. We got to stay out of stupid wars. America first, and all the rest. I mean, he hasn't done any of that. I mean, if Venezuela was so important, why didn't he bring this up during the election? If somehow Maduro posed this great threat, if narco traffickers posed this great threat to the United States, why didn't you say any of that during the re-election? Instead, he posed as this peace candidate. So I think that I think is true. The left was right in saying that Trump never took any of that seriously. Kind of deceive people, but deceive people who wanted to be deceived. I mean, you'd have to say, well, there were plenty of indications from his first term that he's not a peacemaker, and the propagandists on behalf of Trump still insist, oh, he's a peacemaker, he's a peacemaker. People like Steve Bannon, oh, he's a peacemaker. He's starting wars. This Venezuela, he's starting a war. Iran, he started a war. How can you be a peacemaker if you're starting wars? I mean, he brought some wars to an end. What wars did he bring to an end? He hasn't brought any wars to an end. So anyway, Richard Phillips says, I think it was just sociopathic. I mean, they wouldn't. I mean, why would anyone listen to the survivors? The media wouldn't bother talking to them. Yeah, I tend to think that. I think it's just, it's that's what I mean. It's like the Israel mentality. Why do you just kill these people? Well, because we just don't care about their existence. We just don't care. You see two people fighting for their life in the sea. What do we care? Boom, kill them. That's what Bibi would do. Richard Phillips, Ursula looks utterly absurd in that photo. Is that what that was? That Ursula? Oh no, it's Kaya. So it's Kaya. No, so it's Kaya. Okay, that's what I thought. I thought it was Kaya. And then came ARD says, for the photograph in Gagglers, Regis Bossu, the photography of the Bruder Kus photo, died recently. Is that right? That's interesting. That's a famous the famous kiss, because the two of them were just kissing on the mouth. Yeah. That's a yeah. That's quite a kiss. That's yeah. Anyway, thank you for posting that. And then Richard Phillips says, the problem is if people think Russia is escalating, is going to change anything, they're totally mistaken. Europeans will not care, no matter how much damage is done. Quite happy to see the countries harmed. They just don't care. They would just escalate back, then put massive pressure on the Americans to intervene. I think that's right. I think that's it. I think that what the Europeans are doing is they're being provocative. They're trying to provoke Russia, because if you can provoke them, and that's why they issue all these statements, because they're hoping to provoke Russia. And if they can provoke Russia, they can get Trump more actively involved. I mean, that's the strategy. I mean, they know that they can't possibly fight Russia. I mean, it's an absurdity. But with the United States, that's a different matter. And I think that's what. And so you're right. If Russia escalates, then the Europeans turn around and say and tell America, "Hey, this is Russia is threatening us. Russia is going to invade us. We need to do something." At least that's the thing. That's the thinking. Whether that's how it'll materialize, I don't know. But that's the way they think. And the Europeans want to provoke. They want to keep this war going. The only way they can do it is if they can provoke the United States into taking much stronger action. Richard Phillips says Putin broadening the conflict would be a massive mistake. Yeah, this could be. As I say, I tend to be in that camp. I think you gotta have to think this war has gone on long enough. It's 4 years. It's you've achieved certain things. You haven't achieved everything. But continuing with this war, I think, is just, the law of diminishing returns applies. If there was a real chance that Ukraine is going to collapse in the next couple of months, I think that would be different. But I don't see it. I absolutely do not see Ukraine is on the brink of collapse any more than I think that they're going to get rid of Zelensky. So I just don't see it. So all of this talk, Russia should just go on and on. But that is predicated on this war coming to an end soon. That somehow Ukraine will collapse very soon, and I'm not at all sure that's going to happen. And Steve says, and if the Europeans simply sink every Russian oil tanker, what point is far enough? No, well, that's fine. No, I think if they do that, then that's the point about provocation. I mean, provocation, it provokes. You have to do something. But it is no question it's dangerous. Look, the Americans and the Europeans provoked the war in 2022. Russia really had no choice, but it was provoked. They did it. They left Russia with few choices. They wanted this because whichever way it goes, the Europeans and Americans figured that they would do well out of it. If this expansion of NATO and Russia just simply sits on its hands and does nothing, well, that's great. That eliminates Russia as a major power. If Russia gets involved militarily, well, that's also good because then that's that's something that's going to bog Russia down for years and years and years. So they think, that's why you provoke things. Think, we win either way, and I think that's the thinking. It's a very cynical thinking, but that's without question. That's the way the Europeans are thinking, which is keep this war going, maybe escalate because it's bad for Russia. That ends in a nuclear war. Yeah, well, I mean that's the ends in a nuclear war. No, I think that's the thing. That I mean, there's no question. The longer this goes on, the greater the danger that is going to be an all-out war. In fact, I would put. I do think that I would put more money now on it being an all-out war. I don't think this peace plan is going to work. I think they're just so far apart, and that means the war continues. The war continues, then then it's hard to see how it ends short of some serious escalation and serious military confrontation with NATO and Russia, and that means the United States and Russia. All right. Anyway. So where was it? Richard Phillips says Murdoch was a sleazebag that pretty much ruined the Times, no question. NKMRD says many military people say Ukraine is probably capable of defending for some more years. One doesn't build new factory and infrastructure around Europe. We're not expecting that, I guess. So either the US pulls the plug or not. I agree. I think that this could go on for a long time. And with this drone warfare, they're building these drone factories in Ukraine. They're still getting this, they're building missile factories in Ukraine. So I don't think that there's going to be a collapse anytime soon. And as I said last time, there's always the possibility, what about the manpower shortage? Yeah, there's a manpower shortage, but there's a lot of manpower in the world that you can tap into, and the West hasn't yet embarked on tapping into this huge manpower in Asia and Africa. You can bring in a few 100,000, wouldn't be at all difficult. Bring in a few 100,000 into Ukraine. So there's always options to keep it going. Anyway, my time is up. We can of course continue. We will continue this discussion on Thursday, the same time. Thank you everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all of your really interesting questions and comments. I wasn't able to get to all of the comments, but but I tried to get to some. Um, and thank you above all to everyone who put some money into the tip jar. The dogs are asleep, but they'll be waking soon, and they will be as disgruntled and as foul-tempered as ever. But um, you know, I think however, unlike the dogs, I'm very grateful for all of your contributions, and it helps us do whatever we do here. So thank you for that. And we will be back on Thursday at the same time. Until then, all the best. Good night. See you Thursday.